Hello everyone, and welcome to the Biblical Bookworm. My name is Elizabeth, and today I'll talk about the book The Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. And as you've probably seen in the thumbnail, I really like this book, especially because I think that it's particularly helpful for people that are currently going through a period of spiritual desolation. So for example, that would be if you feel like God has abandoned you or you don't feel any love for him. Because in this book, St. John of the Cross explains why this so-called dark night of the soul happens and how it happens. And I think that his explanations can really make you understand why that current suffering is necessary. And by the way, maybe you can hear a difference today in the video. That is because I received a new microphone because a generous subscriber from India bought me one. So thank you to Nick for the microphone, and let's move on with the video. I'd like to start with a short introduction to the author. So St. John of the Cross was a Spanish Catholic priest, mystic, and a Carmelite friar who lived in the 16th century. He was mentored by St. Teresa of Avila, and just like her, he also is a doctor of the Church. His poetry and his studies on the development of the soul are considered the summit of mystical Spanish literature and are among the greatest works of all Spanish literature. The Dark Night of the Soul is a phase of purification of the spirit in the mystical development. And nowadays the term Dark Night of the Soul is understood in a broader sense, meaning spiritual dryness, the absence of experiencing the presence of God, or also generally an extremely difficult and painful period in one's life. This book, together with Ascent of Mount Carmel, which was also written by St. John of the Cross, forms a treatise on the purification of the senses and the spirit, which lead to mystical union. The Dark Night of the Soul is actually a poem by St. John of the Cross, and the books I just named are commentaries on that poem that explain it line by line. And I felt like the best part of the book were the first few chapters, because there St. John explains what imperfections beginners on the spiritual journey might have. And beginners are people who haven't entered the Dark Night of the Soul yet, or who currently experience that Dark Night of the Soul. And imperfections they might have could concern the habit of pride, avarice in the spiritual sense, luxury, wrath, gluttony, spiritual envy, and sloth. And when you read about those imperfections, you really start to understand why God deprives those people of spiritual consolation. Or if you're reading the book to understand your own problem, you really start understanding why that dark night of the soul is necessary for you. Examples of imperfections that beginners might have include satisfaction with their works and with themselves, the wish to teach spiritual things rather than to learn them. When their spiritual directors don't approve of their behavior, they think that the spiritual director simply doesn't understand them. They get irritated at the sins of others, they make big resolutions and fail miserably because of a lack of humility. When praying, those people try to gain some sort of sweet consolation rather than praying out of reverence, and they think that the point of prayer is to experience sensible pleasure. This list goes on and on for pages, so I really recommend you read it because it makes you understand why you don't deserve to feel consolation during prayer, and it makes you realize how many imperfections you still have that you need to work on. St. John explains why the dark night is necessary. Until a soul is placed by God in the passive purgation of the dark night, which we shall soon explain, it cannot purify itself completely from these imperfections, nor from the others. No matter how much an individual does through his own efforts, he cannot actively purify himself enough to be disposed in the least degree for the divine union of the perfection of love. God must take over and purge him in that fire that is dark for him. There are two types of the dark night of the soul. The first one is the dark night of sense, and the second one is the night of spirit. I'll start with explaining the dark night of senses first. The three signs that someone is in the dark night of sense is that the person experiences no consolation, faithfulness, and the inability to meditate. I'll explain now a little bit more what those signs mean, or what those signs look like. No consolation means that the person finds no comfort in the things of God or the world, and their prayer life is dry and unsatisfying. The second sign is faithfulness, and that means that the soul is anxious and careful because it thinks that she's not serving God, but going backwards because she no longer feels spiritual consolation. And the inability to meditate is self-explanatory, I'd say. St. John of the Cross compares beginners to babies that need to be made independent of their mother. And another comparison he makes is that in purgatory, our imperfections are cleansed with a material fire, while the dark night of the soul cleanses us with a spiritual fire. How long and how intense that dark night is depends on the following, quote, "Those who are endowed with the capacity for suffering and who have force sufficient to endure are purified in more intense trials and in less time. But those who are weak are purified very slowly with weak temptations, and the night of their purgation is long. Their senses are refreshed from time to time, lest they should fall away. These, however, come late to the pureness of their perfection in this life, and some of them never. These persons are not clearly in the purgative night, nor clearly out of it. For though they really make no onward progress, yet in order that they may be humble and know themselves, God tries them for a season in aridities and temptations, and visits them with his consolations, at intervals lest they should become faint-hearted, and seek for comfort in the ways of the world. From other souls, still weaker, God, as it were, hides himself, that he may try them in his love, for without his hiding of his face from them, they would never learn how to approach him. But those souls that are to go forward to so blessed and exalted a state as this of the union of love, however quickly God may lead them, tarry long in general amidst aridities, as we see by experience." For reference, Saint Teresa of Calcutta's dark night of the soul was almost 50 years long, while Saint Therese of Lisieux experienced the dark night of the soul for a couple of months before her death. Although I have to mention that I'm not sure what night of the soul they experienced, so whether it was the dark night of the senses or the dark night of the spirit, which I'll talk about in a minute, or whether they experienced both. Then St. John of the Cross proceeds to explain the benefits of the dark night of the senses, and those are, first of all, that it helps you overcome the imperfections beginners tend to have, as I briefly mentioned at the beginning of this video. Then it also increases one's knowledge of self, as people who experience the dark night of senses understand their own misery and realize their dependence on God. The soul also gains knowledge of God, so the soul learns to obey God solely through love. And the last benefit the soul can derive from the dark night of the senses is growth in heroic virtue, as for example the increase of self-knowledge leads to a deeper humility and obedience. St. John also explains that the soul makes most progress when being in darkness, knowing nothing. The road of suffering is more secure and even more profitable than that of fruition and action. First, because in suffering the strength of God is added to that of man, while in action and fruition the soul is practicing its own weakness and imperfections. And second, because in suffering the soul continues to practice and acquire the virtues and become purer, wiser, and more cautious. When it comes to the question what we should do when we experience the dark night of the senses, St. John gives the advice to take courage, be patient, and persevere in prayer. Now we get to the dark night of the spirit, which is the second type of dark night of the soul, and in comparison to the dark night of the senses, which is something that many people experience, as St. John writes, the dark night of the spirit is rare and it only comes to, quote, practice and proficient souls. The night of the spirit concerns the purification of the intellect and the will. People who experience the second night of the senses still have some imperfections they need to be cleansed of. These proficients have two kinds of imperfection. The one kind is habitual, the other actual. The habitual imperfections are the imperfect habits and affections which have remained all the time in the spirit and are like roots to which the purgation of sense has been unable to penetrate. The difference between the purgation of these and that of the other kind is the difference between the root and the branch, or between the removing of a stain which is fresh and one which is old and of long standing. To actual imperfections, all are not liable in the same way. Some, whose spiritual good is so superficial and so readily affected by sense, fall into greater difficulties and dangers, which we described at the beginning of this treatise. For as they find so many and such abundant spiritual communications and apprehensions, both in sense and in spirit, wherein they oftentimes see imaginary and spiritual visions, and as the devil is apt to make such pleasure in impressing upon the soul and suggesting to it the said apprehensions and feelings, he fascinates and deludes it with great ease unless it takes the precaution of resigning itself to God and of protecting itself strongly by means of faith from all these visions and feelings. St. John writes that people who experience the dark night of the spirit have their purgatory on earth. What the dark night of the spirit effects is that it replaces the understanding by faith, memory gets replaced by hope, and the will is emptied of all desires except for the desire to love God. I'd like to end this summary with a beautifully consoling quote from the book. It now remains to be said that although this happy night brings darkness to the spirit, it does so only to give it light in everything, and that although it humbles it and makes it miserable, it does so only to exalt it and to raise it up. And although it impoverishes it and empties it of all natural affection and attachment, it does so only that it may enable it to stretch forward divinely, and thus to have fruition and experience of all things both above and below, yet to persevere its unrestricted liberty of spirit in them all. When it comes to my opinion on the book, I definitely give the book a 10 out of 10, because I think that for people who need an explanation as to why the dark night of the soul is happening to them, and for people who are struggling with dryness in prayer, this book is perfect, because St. John of the Cross gives a long list of imperfections the dark night of the soul helps with, and he really explains well why the dark night of the soul is necessary. That's been it for today. I hope you liked the video. See you next week. God bless, and bye!